Hello S3 historians, and welcome to the last lesson in the Victorian Mysteries topic. It is a case study lesson on Jack the Ripper. Now this lesson is quite big. It is supposed to take the sort of next 2 weeks for you to do the tasks in it and complete them. It's very task based, so it is very long. While you're doing it, the best thing for you to do is make sure that you've downloaded all of the information that you need from the team or the school website, and you've got all of this information. And you've got all of the tasks, so that what you can do is we go through the PowerPoint video here. When we tell you to pause and complete a task, you can actually do that. There will be 2 things that you need to upload onto the assignment tab by the time you finish this, and you'll be able to see what they are as we're kind of going through. But each of the tasks that you complete is going to be really important for this, because when we come back to school after the holidays, in whatever fashion that might be, we will be using some of these tasks to do another lesson before we move on to our new topic. So make sure that you have, again, all of the tasks that you need. There should be 5 of them in total that you need to download and you need the information from. If you can't find them, let your teacher know and we can send them to you and you can find them that way. And make sure you've got something to write with and you've got all of the information you need moving forward. So in your jotter, the best thing for you to do would be to put the heading Case Study Jack the Ripper, and then all of your tasks can go under that, and it's going to be really clear where that is and where that information is for you to find. So in terms of our learning intention for this case study and for the next 2 weeks, we want to explore the Jack the Ripper crimes in a little bit more detail. It is still our Victorian Mysteries topic and it is the last one in that. And the success criteria that we have for the end of this is 3 things. The first, we want to be able to investigate what life was like in Whitechapel in 1888 and why this was particularly good for crime, so you need to be able to explain that. You need to have investigated why Jack may have chosen his victims, so whose victims were and why those particular people, and be able to describe these victims to someone. And we look to examine the evidence that we have about who Jack the Ripper actually was and see if we can come to an understanding of why Jack the Ripper had never been caught up to this point. So this slide just gives you a bit of an overview about who Jack the Ripper actually was and what we know about him. You don't have to write this down, so it's just about listening to it so you've got an idea to set the scene a little bit. So Jack the Ripper is the title that is given to probably one of the most infamous serial killers in Victorian history. It's a popular term for this particular man who murdered 5 women in the East End of London in 1888. The name was very first used in a letter that was supposed to be written by an individual claiming to actually be the killer. He refers to himself as Jack or as the Ripper, and that was the thing that the newspapers and things at the time started to call him, and it kind of caught on with other people calling him that. Since there was no evidence about who he actually was, it was a very popular sort of name that he became known as. The killings themselves take place within a mile area and involve the district of Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Aldgate and the City of London. But Whitechapel tends to be the kind of main area where a lot of these particular murders took place, or at least where the people and the victims were actually from. The killer was also known because of that as the Whitechapel Murderer or Leather Apron, and that's because a lot of people thought he was maybe a surgeon, and at the time in Victorian Britain, surgeons obviously would not have been wearing the same sort of things as we would see them with today. It would be more common that they would wear a leather apron over their normal clothes when they were performing surgery and things like that. So why was the Ripper infamous out of all of the serial killers and the sort of criminals that we've looked at this point in time? The Ripper is the very first serial killer in a major modern city with quite a highly educated population. So this is like a brand new sort of thing, different type of crime than they'd ever encountered before. His crimes are very well documented by the police and also by the press, so again it's one of the first times that we actually see the press being as involved in the crimes and the reporting of the crimes as the police and things were. Newspapers at this time are rather cheap, and even though quite a lot of people are maybe not as literate as they would be today, so they can't maybe read and write, there was a very high percentage of people that could or would buy newspapers to read to other people. So news was something that was really, really important, and this was kind of a big scandal and a big news point. Not just because it was murder, which again, you know, very much is a big thing at this point in a major modern city in Victorian Britain, but also because the police were not any further with catching him, and these sort of things normally didn't happen. So they were very, very confused about what was actually going on, and it became kind of front page news for a very long time. The Ripper also appears during a time of political turmoil and social unrest in Britain. People are starting to question, why are they in the positions that they are in? Why don't they have more of a say in government and in politics? And they're starting to try and campaign to get this say. So this is kind of happening as a backdrop to these murders, which again makes them really, really a popular thing for newspapers to report on, and for people to sort of make claims like, if we were rich and we lived in these rich areas, then things would be done about it, but because the Ripper's targeting poorer areas, things are not being done about it. It's very kind of similar to some of the political situations that are maybe happening today, that it helps to make other things and other crimes or other newsworthy things really very, very popular in the media's eye. So that's the same sort of idea as why the Ripper murders were probably as infamous as they were, because they were talked about a lot more than they would have been necessarily if there hadn't been other things going on that made this an important point. The fact also was that the Ripper terrified a city the size of London by leaving his sort of grossly mutilated victims in plain sight. What we've seen so far is things like with Burke and Hare. When people do commit these types of crimes, the bodies are taken away and they're dumped somewhere out of the way, or they're put into graves, or they're sold to medical schools. Jack the Ripper was one of the very first serial killers in Victorian Britain and in Victorian history who left his victims for the police to find, and did it in a very creepy, gruesome way so that they could know that it was him every time that he did these things, almost like he was showing off. So unlike Burke and Hare, where we see them committing these crimes in order to sell the bodies and make money, or the body snatchers and things like that, it seemed like Jack the Ripper was just doing this to show off and because he could, which again was a very scary idea for Victorian Britain. It's not something that they'd encountered before, and it was something that was really very terrifying for them. Also, the fact was that no matter what the police did, Jack the Ripper had never been caught, and never was caught. So like we've already seen, in terms of what Britain actually looks like in 1888, it's a very divided city. Just like today, the West End was very wealthy, very affluent, they had very big houses and things like that, and a lot more access to things like education and things, whereas the East End was much poorer. They're living in these sort of slum communities that we have seen in the documentary and in the sort of health and housing lessons, and they're more likely to be suffering from things like cholera spreading and things like that as well. So your first task, you're going to use the worksheet below, which is labelled as the task 1, and a set of the task 1 cards, to fill out some information, not all of the information, but some information about what life would have actually been like if you were living in Whitechapel during this period of time. So you're looking for 5 bits of information as you go through the cards. You're looking for information about employment, you're looking for information about the type of people that would have lived there, how alcohol played a part in their lives, what their housing was like, and what pollution was like in their lives as well. So I'm going to use the next couple of slides to go through the cards, and you can either use the slides or you can use the cards themselves to download them and fill out this worksheet. Draw it out in your jotter if you want to. If you're drawing it out rather than printing it out or answering it online, I would make sure that you either turn your jotter or get a bigger piece of paper, or maybe use a double page to try and fit all of your information in. You don't have to lay it out exactly the same as that, so if you're not a mind map person, you could just decide to put the headings and put some bullet points. That's absolutely fine. So this is source A. It is a photo of the smog that you would have seen in Whitechapel, for example. So this is not on a foggy day or anything, this is just how it would have looked as normal. All of this kind of smog and things like that is coming from the factories, and it's so thick that you couldn't actually see a metre in front of you. They called it a pea super smog because it had a kind of greenish tinge to it, which is because of the factories and things like that. So this was one of the kind of situations that you would find because of pollution in Whitechapel, that it was difficult for you to actually see in front of you because of the smog. Source B shows you a photo of the type of housing that you would find in Whitechapel. They're back to back, so they're very, very close together, which means that there's an awful lot of overcrowding and a lot of alleyways and things like that that you could use to move throughout the place. It was almost maze-like, and the housing is not going to be very good condition. So that's kind of a bit about housing. Source C tells you a little bit about Christchurch, which was an old church building in Whitechapel. Its graveyard was often known as Itchy Park because a lot of the homeless people would go there at night to sleep, and they were quite often covered in lice, so they would park themselves there, and because they had lice they were itchy, so that's what it got called. It means that there is a lot of homeless people and people that wouldn't really necessarily be missed living in Whitechapel, so that's a good point about the people. Quite often they wouldn't be missed if something had happened to them. Source D, a little bit difficult to make out, but it's kind of a map of the Whitechapel area and all of the roads, which it shows you it's kind of like this huge big maze-like area of London, near the Thames. So it'd be very easy for someone to be able to escape really quickly if they knew the area really well and travel really quickly through this area without being necessarily caught or arousing suspicion, because there was lots of different alleys and things like that you could escape down. Source E is a picture of the houses that were painted under a railway bridge in Whitechapel, and again this is part of the pollution issue because smoke and things from the train and soot from the trains would quite often turn these houses black, so the brickwork would be black and covered in a coating of soot and things like that as well, which meant it was quite dark and again quite smoggy and not particularly nice, but also it was quite noisy in this area as well, so it was very unlikely you would have maybe heard anything if crime was being committed. Source F is a photo of the Whitechapel Road. So in one small section of this road in 1888 there were actually 6 different pubs. The pub was basically the only thing that people actually had, and if they were trying to come together or hang out together, the pub was the only place they could really go. There wasn't really very many cafes and things like that, or restaurants. It was the pub or at home basically, or the church. So alcohol played a big part in that, because if they were going to the pub to see their friends, which was the only place they could go, they would quite often be buying drinks and things from each other, so alcohol was quite a serious issue because a lot of people were drinking quite a lot of the time. Source G shows you a picture of 2 women. Because there wasn't an awful lot of jobs that were available for women in Whitechapel at this time, they would quite often do things like lounge dancing and things like that to be paid, where men would quite often be quite aggressive with them, or some of them turned to things like prostitution. So it wasn't uncommon to see women maybe walking to work late at night in Whitechapel, or coming back from work late at night, or being with maybe strangers that didn't normally live in the area, so that wouldn't alert suspicion to a potential murderer or anything like that, this person that's strange to the area, because it was quite common. Source H is a quotation from an author in 1883 about the Whitechapel area, so before the Jack the Ripper murders happened, and he calls it perhaps the foulest and most dangerous street in the whole metropolis. So basically what he's saying is that out of all of the streets in London, Whitechapel was probably the most disgusting, probably the worst and the most dangerous that he had ever encountered. Okay, source I is a Whitechapel workhouse. We've kind of had a chat about workhouses and things as well. That's where you could go if you were poor and you couldn't afford to live in a slum area, or even in the doss house. If you were homeless or you were out of work, you could go to the workhouse and things like that, and then you could have a bed and a meal and things like that, and a place to work. But quite often these were kind of like prisons almost. It was very tough, and once you went in it was very difficult to then come out again, because you had to pay for the bed and the meal and stuff that you were getting by working your debt off, and the longer you stayed, the higher your debt went. So you wouldn't be given money. All the money you would make basically went to keeping you there. Unemployment is really very high in the 1880s, and in Whitechapel in particular. The reason this workhouse was built there is because a lot of people are desperate for jobs. So a lot of people from the area would be coming into the workhouse or coming in and out of that area to kind of work there. Again, it wouldn't be uncommon to see strangers coming in for maybe a few weeks and then maybe leaving, or homeless people in the streets and things like that, because they were trying to avoid the workhouse as well. Source J is a secondary source because it's from a textbook, and it tells you a little bit about Whitechapel at the end of the 19th century. It says Whitechapel was the home of London's immigrant population. So people that were moving into London went there. People mistrusted the 50,000 Jewish people that had moved there in the mid to the late 1800s, and people were nervous of new people and didn't trust them. So they're kind of saying there that they tried to keep themselves to themselves, but there was quite often new people coming into this particular area of London, and it was common to see new people coming in and out, especially people arriving on boats and things nearby, so it wouldn't be uncommon if a stranger did appear. Source K is also a visitor to Whitechapel who's talking about the people who had resorted to prostitution walking about the streets, and what he says here is the fearful prevalence, which means the commonness, so it happens a lot, of a huge amount of street prostitution, a very disgusting character, so people that don't look particularly nice, people that look poor and impoverished, particularly between the hours of 10 and 12 at night, at which it is not fit for any respectable female to walk about. So again, it's this idea that the people wouldn't have batted an eyelid about women being outside at night, and about maybe them being in the company of men that they didn't know at this point in time. So if Jack the Ripper was a stranger, they wouldn't necessarily pick up on that or think it's suspicious, and if he wasn't a stranger and it was someone that knew the area or lived in the area, again they wouldn't think it was suspicious either, because they were used to people coming in and out, and they were also used to people being there at different times of night. Source L is also from a history textbook. It talks about how common alcoholism was. So it says, with the little money they earned, most would seek comfort in alcohol as the only refuge from reality, so it's the only escape they have. Drink was cheap and drunkenness rife, at any time of day or night, leading to brutality and violence as the direct result. So basically what he's saying in this source is that people were able to buy a bottle of gin, for example, for less than they could a bottle of beer, and if it was a cold night and you were homeless, you're more likely to actually buy the bottle of gin, because it was the old idea that it would keep you warm, which obviously is not true, but they did believe that, or they were just trying to escape from the reality by getting very drunk. And then because of that, there'd be a lot of crime and a lot of noise and things like that, and a lot of violence and fighting happening in Whitechapel, so you wouldn't necessarily notice something else or someone crying out for help over the noise of all of the other things that were going on. So pause the video at roughly about 19 minutes and 25 seconds. Use the information in the cards or the last couple of slides to fill in your worksheet, and then start the video for the next task. Okay, so now we should know what the main features of life in Whitechapel actually were like. If you haven't done that task, please go back and do it, because obviously it's going to be easier to just pause the video, do the task and then come back to the video rather than try to do all the tasks at the end. So we're now going into task 2. So you need to download the task 2 folder, which will look like this. So it's a table that gives you some facts about the conditions that we've just talked about in the East End and in Whitechapel, and we're thinking this time about why Whitechapel was so good for crime. So why did these particular things help Jack the Ripper commit the crimes that he did commit, so these gruesome, terrible murders? So make sure you download the second task, and you can draw the table out, or you can use the one that's on Word if you want to do that, whatever you prefer doing, and then read the information in the facts column and then put your opinion about why you think this would have helped Jack the Ripper commit these particular crimes. So pause the video, 20 minutes and 45 seconds, complete task 2 and then start the video up again. So now we should have completed task 1 and 2. Again, if you haven't, stop the video, go back and make sure that you do those. And we're now having a bit of a think about Jack's victims. So it's generally agreed that the Ripper killed 5 women, which we call the canonical 5. But we don't actually know if those were the only 5 that he was responsible for the murders of. Some claim that it could be as much as 11, it could be even more, but we don't have an exact number other than these 5 women that we know for a fact was definitely Jack the Ripper. The first one, the very first victim, was a woman called Mary Ann Nichols. She went by the nickname Polly, and she was murdered on Friday, August the 31st, 1888. She was the very first victim. The second one was a woman called Annie Chapman, who was murdered on a Saturday, September 8th, 1888. The third was Elizabeth Stride, sometimes known as Elizabeth Stroud, just depending on what sources you look at, and she was murdered on a Sunday, September the 30th, 1888. Number 4 was Catherine Eddowes, who was also murdered on the same day, Sunday the 30th of September 1888, and the 5th was Mary Jean Kelly, who was murdered on Friday the 9th of November 1888. So these are the 5 that we know about. Only 2 of them were killed on the same time. The really interesting thing is that all of the victims were killed on a weekend, so that has led historians through time to kind of think that Jack the Ripper was probably someone that had a job and that he worked during the week sort of periods and things, and because there's such big gaps in between each of the killings, that maybe he didn't live locally, or if he did live locally he maybe didn't work locally, so he went away somewhere for work and he only did this when he was back in the area. At the time of each of these victims' murders, it was generally thought that they had been in the company of someone and had been in a pub and had been very drunk and maybe involved in some arguments and things before they then left. So we know that each of the victims generally was drunk at the time of their murder, so they were unlikely to be able to defend themselves in that situation. This map shows you where each of the women were kind of found, or where similar murders and things like that were found, because there's obviously more than 5, and we think that some of these might have also been Jack the Ripper as well, but the canonical 5 were obviously all found in the Whitechapel area, and it's kind of a big sort of circle between where we kind of think these are. So if we kind of fill in the blank sort of bits, and we just kind of use this to go around the outskirts of it. It's a really wide area, but all of it seems to be centred around Whitechapel in the very middle, which is why it's referred to as the Whitechapel murders in some instances. So, how did Jack the Ripper murder his victims? First of all, what each of the victims had done to them was that they were strangled until they either died and choked or they were unconscious. And autopsies and very limited technologies they had at the time for this support that this was actually the cause of death for them, so they were killed by being strangled. And this was not an uncommon way for victims to be killed at criminal points at this point in time, but it's what happens next that is very different from any other crime that has happened in Whitechapel before this point. After Jack the Ripper had strangled his victims, he lowered the victims to the ground and then he turned their heads to the left, always to the left, which was something he did with every victim. The victim's throat was then cut while they were lying on the ground, and that meant that the blood spatter pattern, so the way that the blood came out of the body, actually pooled beside the neck and the head rather than in front of the body or splashing onto anybody else. So he was very careful not to get any blood on himself or arouse suspicion by having blood and things on him as well. The victim's throats were all cut from the left to the right, which tends to suggest to forensic scientists who investigated at the time and since then that Jack the Ripper was right-handed, and the reason that he did this was so that he wouldn't actually get blood splattered on him and he could run without blood being on him as well. This is because blood would flow in the direction opposite where the killer was standing if he was right-handed. And it's also been claimed that the killer had a reasonable knowledge of the human anatomy, so he therefore may have been a surgeon or a butcher of some sort, because not only did he cut their throats open, but quite often he cut open bits of their bodies and pulled out other bits of their organs. Now, he didn't take them or do anything with them, he just pulled them out. And he didn't pull them out in a way that would show that he was breaking any of the pieces of them or damaging the organs. He did it with surgical precision, which is why a lot of people and a lot of historians did think he might have been a surgeon or a butcher or someone that actually did have a lot of knowledge about the anatomy of a human or something, and how to get these organs out without damaging it. So, task number 3. So you're looking for the task number 3 table that looks like this, which is talking about the victims of Jack the Ripper. You can see all 5 of them are filled in there, and you're looking for the task 3 cards. Now, we don't have these on the next slide, so you're going to have to make sure you download them and use them, and you're looking to find the information in the cards about each of the different victims. So we've put the names of them down and the dates that they were killed, so you're looking for where did they live, were they married or divorced or things. We're looking for the dates and things that they died and what happened to them, and any other information that you can find. So pause the video at roughly about 28 and sort of 45 seconds or so, or 50 seconds, complete task 3, draw it out in your jotter, complete the task, and then start the video up again. Okay, so now you should have completed tasks 1, 2 and 3. If you haven't, go back and make sure that you do them, because it's going to be so much easier if you complete the tasks as we go, rather than trying to watch the whole thing and then not knowing what you're doing for the tasks. So do each task one at a time, and then that way you'll know exactly what you're doing. So the question is, why was Jack the Ripper never actually caught at this point in time? The reality is, even today in 2020, it's actually very difficult to catch a serial killer that actually doesn't want to be caught, and that's with all the advancements in modern technology and things as well. And this is because the victims generally are unknown to the criminal, and it's hard to establish a link sometimes, which is why professionals are often involved in that. But in the 1880s, forensic science was just in its infancy. They were only just starting to understand how to do things like take fingerprints and things like that. So they didn't have the same level of technology as that we would have had today, which meant it was really difficult to get things like a link between the victim and the criminal, because there was no such thing as like DNA analysis or anything like that. So basic tools of what we call criminology, like modern criminology, so the study of crime and things like that, fingerprinting, blood typing, DNA, they're generally unavailable to investigators to properly do. Some fingerprinting could be used, but it wasn't very reliable, and there was no way to check it against other fingerprints. You could just see that there were fingerprints maybe there, or boot prints or something like that. But there was no way to type the blood or do anything like that that was useful. Also, the fact was that the Ripper tended to attack at times when the streets were largely deserted, so it had been busy but it was starting to quieten down, and he definitely always chose victims who were usually drunk and defenceless, and quite often wouldn't necessarily be strange for those particular women to be in the street with a man that maybe their neighbours didn't know, or things like that, especially if they had been drinking. He was very swift when he attacked. He did it very quickly and almost like he had a precise method, again linking back to this idea he might have been a surgeon, and he left very little time for him to be actually caught. He got in, did the crime, left the body looking scary and creepy with organs hanging out, and then off he went into this very foggy, maze-like street. So even the victims' sort of witnesses that we will talk about shortly, none of them could ever get an exact match of what they thought he looked like, because it was so dark, or they couldn't see him because of the smog, or even sometimes in certain circumstances there were witnesses standing right beside where he was committing the crime that didn't always actually hear it until the last minute, and all they saw was a tall dark stranger wandering off into the night, so they didn't really have much to go on. And he also tended not to leave any evidence as to who he might be. So really the only evidence about who he possibly might be that we had at the time was from the letters that he himself supposedly wrote and sent to the police and to the local newspapers, explaining that he was Jack the Ripper and he was committing these crimes. But he never explained who he was or why he was doing it. So it was very difficult for the police to catch him because they pretty much had no evidence to go on. So, task 4, we're going to think about who the suspects actually were for who we think Jack the Ripper might have been. And there's a few cards that you're going to use for this. So you need to find the task 4 worksheet, which looks like the one on the picture on the slide there. Again, it's a table, but you can draw it out in your jotter or your notes or things like that, or you can download it to just fill it in on the computer, on Word, whatever is easiest for you. So make sure you find task 4, and you're going to use the task 4 cards information. And if you don't want to use the card information, you can use the next couple of slides, which gives you the information as well. So remember, we're looking for reasons why they might be guilty. We're looking for any sort of reasons why they are not guilty and any alibis that they maybe have, and you're looking just for maybe 1 or 2 bullet points of key points from the cards in each of the different potential people. So this is the task 4 cards. We'll just kind of go through and look for some key points. The first potential suspect was Prince Albert, the Duke of Clarence, who was the son of King Edward and the grandson of Queen Victoria. He was second in line to the throne, and the reason that he was suspected is because in 1870 a British physician, a man named Thomas Stowell, published an article where he had stated that Prince Albert had committed these murders during fits of what he called insanity caused by having syphilis, which again was almost a death sentence and a very serious thing in Victorian Britain. So he made this claim and sold loads of newspapers and things like that, but we don't actually know whether or not it was true. Official records and newspaper reports and other sources at the time are kind of talking about that this was maybe the case, but every other piece of evidence that we actually have shows that Prince Albert was actually no place near Whitechapel when any of these victims died. And in fact, because he was so famous and they would have known who he was, it would have been almost impossible for Prince Albert to go around Whitechapel and someone not notice that he was there, or for people other places in London not to notice that the prince was missing and wandering around a very seedy, disgusting area of London. So some key points we could say here is the reason that he was maybe accused was that a physician Thomas Stowell, published an article that he had committed the murders during fits of insanity. But official records, newspaper reports and other sources, however, offer strong indication that the Prince was nowhere near Whitechapel when the victims died. So you're looking to fill in the key points of your information about Prince Albert. The second suspect is a man called Montague John Druitt, and he was one of the top 3 suspects that they actually had at the time. 7 weeks after the 5th and final murder, he was however found floating in the River Thames, and investigators concluded that the cause of death was suicide. Druitt had been a teacher who had been fired from a post at a boarding school nearby. His father had died and his mother was institutionalised, so she went to a mental hospital basically because she had gone insane. And that was apparently what tipped him over the edge, and he just went crazy, supposedly. And the problem with this is, though he was one of the top suspects, and some of the police investigators were happy that once he had died, no other victims actually happened, that it was him that was to blame. But there is no actual concrete evidence that connects him to these murders, and the fact that the carnage ended right after his death is enough for some, like the detective in charge of the case, which was Melville Leslie McNaughton, but not enough for everybody. So we don't know whether or not he was definitely the murderer. He doesn't actually have that much of an alibi, and there's a lot of really bad evidence to say that he had been quite violent in the past, and because the murders did stop after he died, it might be the case that Mr. Druitt is our Jack the Ripper suspect. So again, use the key bits of information that you think could be here and fill in just maybe 1 or 2 bullet points in each point on your grid. So another 3 suspects here. We've got Joseph Barnett, who was a fish porter at Billingsgate Market. By 1888, he actually knew one of the victims quite well, and the theory goes that he had fallen deeply in love with Mary Jane Kelly, and basically what had happened is he'd committed the first murder by murdering one of the women that worked in the pubs and things like that, and was sometimes working on the streets, to try and scare her so she wouldn't do the same thing and she wouldn't keep working on the streets, because that's something that she had started to do. And when that didn't work, he turned on her and killed her as well. Now, interestingly, one of the kind of really damning things for poor Joseph Barnett is that his physical appearance and the psychological profile of a man deeply in love, driven mad. You're maybe notice a pattern here, everybody's been driven mad by this love and being unable to protect his love, was a really close match for what witnesses actually said at the time. And when modern day investigations have taken place looking for Jack the Ripper, specialist FBI agents called profilers have kind of made an idea of what this type of person would have been like and what their backstory might have been like. And Joseph Barnett fits that in every possible way. So that's not particularly good for good old Joseph Barnett. So again, key points that you maybe want to put in your table, and maybe 1 or 2 bullet points for each bit about Joseph Barnett. Our next suspect is a man called Frederick Deeming, who was a sailor, who again was known to suffer something called brain fever, which is fits of madness, which is again a pattern that we're seeing developing here, and was often noted as a cheat. He had previously been jailed for crimes and violence and things like that as well, in pubs where he was accused of cheating, and eventually he killed and murdered his 2 wives and children, so his wife and his ex-wife and his children, and their bodies were found by the owner of the house that he rented because they had started to smell. And he was actually caught and jailed. He was caught in Kirriemuir, interestingly, and then he was sent to Perth prison in 1892. And he had lived in sort of the outskirts of Kirriemuir, between Kirriemuir and Forfar before that, which is where this supposedly took place. And then he had been sent to Perth prison for his crimes of murder for his wives and children. And when he was in jail in Perth, he supposedly told the other inmates that he was Jack the Ripper. But the fact that we have now as well tells us that though he was maybe violent and aggressive, and certainly capable of it, he was actually in South Africa at the time when these Ripper murders took place. So it completely rules him out as being a suspect. Our next suspect is Dr. T. Neil Cream, who was a Scottish doctor. He was a known abortionist and lady killer at this point in time, who escaped conviction until he poisoned one of his patients and blamed the pharmacist. And when they dug up the body, when the pharmacist pled not guilty, they found poison within her body, and he'd been sent to jail, but he got out of jail because of good behaviour. But the story goes that he was not able to stop murdering women the way he had with his patients, and that was how the Jack the Ripper murders then happened. He later on murdered a woman called Matilda Clover, and finally at that point he was caught and was hanged. He was hung for his crimes, and apparently when they put the noose around his neck, the last 3 words he actually said was, "I am Jack." And that was kind of a big media scandal. Is he or was he Jack the Ripper? However, the reason we know he probably isn't is because the style of the murders and the fact that he was actually in prison when they were committed makes the theory that it was him a bit sketchy. So he couldn't have committed them because he wasn't a free man at that point in time. Our last 2 suspects then, we've got a man called Carol Friedbaum, who was executed for murdering a woman in New York in 1894, so well after the Ripper murders. A former detective, a man called Trevor Marriott, points to the fact that there were 2 merchant docks near Whitechapel where sailors could come in, and that the sailors that did through this were known to go to local brothels, and it is believed that the Ripper targeted these prostitutes and women that worked in these places, and also that Carol was quite often similar to all of the crimes that Jack had committed. Carol had also then done this to his victim, which he was hanged for in New York 6 years later. He had a string of aliases, so different names that he went by, and he'd been on merchant ships under loads of different names that had actually docked near Whitechapel, and it was actually found that he had been in Whitechapel on every single date from a ship that the 5 Jack the Ripper murders happened. So he was actually in Whitechapel when each Jack the Ripper murder happened, and because they are so spaced out and far apart, it would make sense that he might have been the murderer, because the merchant ships would have been spaced out and far apart when they actually docked. So he's probably our number 1 suspect at the moment. Probably one of the most recent suspect things is this idea that maybe it wasn't actually a man, that it was a woman, and that got the phrase Jill the Ripper attached to it. And over the years, a number of people, including the man who wrote Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, have considered it this possibility that he was definitely not a he, that he was a female. And the only female suspect that was actually considered by detectives investigating the case was a woman called Mary Percy, who was an Englishwoman who in 1890, so 2 years later, was executed by hanging because she murdered her fiancé, her lover, her boyfriend's wife and child with a carving knife when he left her for this other woman. And in 2006, a study by an Australian scientist called Ian Findlay actually yielded some surprising results about that, which gave some more evidence to this theory that it might have been a woman. So he travelled to London and he collected saliva samples from the Jack the Ripper letters that had been sent to newspapers and police, the ones that the police thought were definitely probably from Jack, and then he took DNA samples from other things and used cutting edge technology to basically create a profile from what this would have looked like. So who is this and what type of person would they have looked like? And though these findings were really sketchy and they're not conclusive and we didn't know a lot about them because again the technology to do what he was doing was still quite new, it does suggest that the sender might actually have been a woman, which adds more information to that. So we've gone through each of the suspects. You've got the suspect card information that we just went through as well. Stop the video at 45 minutes and say 30 seconds. Complete task 4's worksheet, stick it in, glue it in, and then come back for the next task. Okay, so we now have completed 4 tasks in our case study. If you haven't completed the 4 tasks, pause the video, go back, make sure you're doing the tasks one at a time as you go and following the instructions carefully. So we now have investigated the suspects and what we maybe think about them. We're now starting to think about who or what was to blame for the fact that Jack the Ripper has never actually been caught. So the police methods at the time, we know they couldn't actually use DNA profiling and things like that. So we're thinking about what they maybe did suggest trying to do. Now the problem that they had was that because the crimes were actually being committed at different parts of Whitechapel, it was actually different police forces who were trying to investigate each murder. So it wasn't just one unified police force that were trying to do it, it was different sections of it. And each murder was in a slightly different part of Whitechapel, which was under the jurisdiction or the control of different groups. So one of the methods that they actually used or suggested using was to have closer communication between the investigators, so that if one found evidence, they would actually share that information with each other rather than just keeping it to themselves, which seems like a bit of a no-brainer, but that's not obviously what they were doing. Another thing that they tried to use was bloodhounds to try and see if they could pick up a scent and follow like a trail for maybe where the murderer was going, but that obviously didn't work very well. Because of the high levels of pollution in Whitechapel, it was very unlikely that they were going to be able to find a trail that would actually lead to something. They then offered a public pardon. They were starting to think that maybe this was not just one man, so very similar to like what happened with Burke and Hare. They were convinced it was maybe the work of more than one person. So they offered a public pardon for any accomplices or anyone that actually came forward and said that they had helped the Ripper with these murders would be given the King's licence to then, turn the King's evidence, similar to what Burke and Hare did, and then it would only be whoever was apprehended that was actually accused and then tried. So that obviously doesn't work because no one comes forward. So then they decide what they're going to do is they're going to dress up some of the policemen as women and send them out into the streets at the same time the Ripper is out and about, and see if that actually makes any difference to the situation. It doesn't. The Ripper doesn't strike these policemen dressed up as women, so they don't actually have any further evidence to go on. They then request more police officers in the Whitechapel area to try and deal with the high levels of crimes, because it was actually nearly impossible for them to do any sort of investigation, because actually what just kept happening is that the police officers and things like that were ending up having to deal with other crimes and other situations. So the methods were not particularly great for the police. So task 5 then, what you're going to do with this is you're going to draw out a table that's similar to this one here. So in one column you're going to have mistakes that were made by the police, things that are to do with the location of where Whitechapel actually is, and things that are skills of this murderer. And we're going to make this table to try and work out why Jack the Ripper actually was never caught. So was it the location he picked, was it the mistakes, or was it that he had particular skills that made it difficult to catch him? And you're going to use the cards that are in the task 5 card sort folder or attached to the instructions in the team to help you build this table. And they're on the next slides and we'll talk through them as well, but this is what it might look like. So for example, one of the examples of police mistakes why Jack the Ripper was never caught was the fact that they sometimes actually destroyed evidence by trying to pick it up or move it around so that other teams and other groups didn't necessarily find it, or they inadvertently moved the bodies or washed the bodies because it was covered in blood, which would have washed away any sort of trace evidence of anything that they could have used. The location, Whitechapel was made of dark lanes and alleys, which made it really easy to escape, so that was really difficult for police to catch the Ripper, so that was a location thing that made it difficult. And then for skills of the murderer, just for example, medical education was only open to the upper classes at this point in time, so if we think that he was a doctor, it was very likely that he was quite well educated and he probably had a lot of money, so anyone that maybe did see him or anything like that, you could buy them off, or they wouldn't necessarily suspect him because he's not like the other groups of people that you find in Whitechapel at this time. So what you have to do is pause the video at 50 minutes and 45 seconds and draw the table for the 3 columns, and you might want to use a different column for each of these in a different colour and a different thing. And then we're going to use the next couple of slides to fill it in. So now you should have drawn your table in with your 3 columns for police mistakes, the location and the skills of Jack the Ripper. And you're using these cards, which are in the card sort folder if you want to use the digital sort of document version rather than looking at the PowerPoint, or you can use the PowerPoint to fill it in. So the first one is the example one that we've got here, the police even destroyed evidence. So all I would do in my police mistakes column is I would put that sentence that I've just highlighted in there. So the words, the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, were wiped down from a wall above a piece of Catherine Eddowes, one of the victims' apron, before a crime scene photographer arrived. So even that, they were destroying evidence before they could even take a photo of what the actual crime scene looked like. Card number 2, just in the middle here, it says, beside the 5 prostitutes that were murdered in the autumn of 1888, there have been other murders connected to the Ripper. So that would be a key point that I was going to just highlight here. And the names of the women. So Emma Smith and Martha Tabram were murdered in the spring and summer of 1988. Alice Mackenzie and Frances Coles. So this is a police mistake because they didn't actually count these particular women as part of this. So can't really write with the mouse, which is just terrible. So you guys will have an easier time. Okay, we'll not do that. So basically what you would just add in for there for police mistakes is that there have been other murders connected to the Ripper, Emma Smith, Martha Tabram, Alice Mackenzie, Frances Coles, who the police ignored, would be a good thing for the mistakes there. The next one says there was a large amount of immigration into the East End of London during the 19th century, especially Jews from Eastern Europe. Many of them used aliases. It was impossible to keep track of who moved in and out of the Whitechapel at this time. So I would just put that last bit there. It was impossible to keep track of who moved in and out of Whitechapel at this time, and that's a location point. Okay, so what I will do is I'll just kind of put into it. So this one's a P for police mistakes. This one's a P for police mistakes, and this one is a location point in there. So that could go into your table. The next row, we've got the murders happened in 2 different policing areas. So that's a police mistake point as well, because we're obviously saying that some of the murders were investigated by the Metropolitan Police and some were investigated by the City Police, and they didn't join up their investigations, so they weren't able to do an awful lot there. The next card says the police investigated many leads which originated in press stories. So again, that's another police mistake. So rather than actually going out and investigating themselves, they listened to what the press were saying, and for example, they arrested a man called John Pitzer, who was a Polish bootmaker, after the Star newspaper published a story that the murderer was a Jewish man that wore a leather apron. So they just found the first Jewish man that wore a leather apron in the Whitechapel area and they arrested him, which is obviously not correct, so that's another police mistake. The next one we have, Inspector Frederick Alberline was in charge of the case. He had served 25 years in the Metropolitan Police Force and most of the time was working in Whitechapel. So that's actually not a mistake or anything to do with Whitechapel, so we would just leave that card out, we don't need it. The next one we've got, Queen Victoria showed concern that the Whitechapel murderer had not been caught and demanded that the street lighting in Whitechapel be improved and better detectives appointed to the case. So again, it's a good point to know, but it doesn't actually help us work out anything about why he wasn't caught, and therefore we can ignore that card too. The next one says there had been suggestions that the Whitechapel murderer may have been a member of the powerful secret society called the Freemasons. This could explain the mistakes made by some members of the police force. So we could say something like, murderer may have been a member of the Freemasons, and obviously you'll be writing this in, so you'll be much neater and tidier than I am, and we could say this could explain the mistakes. Okay, so murderer may have been a member of the Freemasons, and this could explain the mistakes, and that would be technically a skill of the murderer, so we'll put that as our first S. Our next card then says many of the suspects, such as Michael Ostrong and Sir William Gull, had links to the medical profession. So again, it's difficult to know who exactly it could be because there's lots of different doctors and things around. So we can say for skills of the murderer is that many of the suspects had links to the medical profession, so it was really difficult to know if they had the right person or not. So very difficult to then catch them. So for this one, this would be a skills by the murderer bit here. So we don't need this card, and we don't need this card, and we've got 4 police mistakes, 2 murderer skills, and a location of Whitechapel card to put into your columns. So pause it on this slide, roughly about 56, 59, and then we'll move on to the next part for this task. So our next cards, again, we're still working on our table for this task. It says Whitechapel was very densely populated. So this means there's a lot of people, very easy for the murderer to slip away in the crowd, and we could just put that in as well. Easy for the murderer to slip away. And that one's definitely a location point. So even if you had witnesses, it would be difficult to actually see. The next one says Whitechapel was a poor area with a high crime rate. And again, this would mean that people were less likely to actually stop crime. So it says this would mean that the police would have been overstretched, loads of crime and things happening, and the amount of criminality meant that most of the people in Whitechapel did not trust the police force. So some of them were criminals, so they wouldn't have trusted the police, so they wouldn't have helped them with their investigation. The next one says Whitechapel is a maze of dark lanes and alleyways. So we already had that in our example one, and that one is a location point as well. It meant that it could give the murderer spaces to actually commit the crimes, and it had an easy route to escape after the crime happened really quickly and really effectively. Our next card then says many people believed that the nature of the attacks prove the murderer had some anatomical knowledge. So that would be skills of the murderer bit and some medical training. So because of that, it was really, again, difficult to know who this person could be. They weren't looking for just some random person. It was someone that was actually planning these, and this meant they were planning not to get caught. So that's something that was important. This one says education, especially medical education, was only open to the upper classes in the 19th century, so the murderer may have been rich and well educated. Technically that's a skill of the murderer, because obviously they're not going to be able to arrest someone if they're very wealthy and powerful, and it's less likely that the wealthy and powerful would commit a crime that they thought they were going to be caught for doing. Our next card says, as there appear to be no witnesses, and with the exceptions of Elizabeth Stride, the murderer was not rushed in his crimes. This shows a level of intelligent planning and execution of the crime. So we'll just say intelligent planning and execution of the crimes is another skills for the murderer point. He took his time, he definitely planned it. That does look more like a 5 than an S, but it is a skills point. Our next slide then, or sorry, our next card says the Metropolitan Police Force was in its infancy in 1888. Almost all of the methods of tracking and solving crimes that we take for granted today were unknown. Police work was mostly concentrated with the prevention of crime by officers on the beat. So from that bit I would say almost all the methods of tracking and solving crimes today were unknown, and that one would be a mistake obviously made by police because they didn't try anything different. They just tried to keep the men in the streets and see if they could find out any information rather than investigate. Our next one says the detectives in charge of the case based much of their investigations on the evidence of Elizabeth Long, so someone that had said she'd seen things but didn't really, and her evidence was vague and unreliable. So again, that's another police mistake point that we've got here, so P. Next card says the police did produce a leaflet asking for information, but this did not get much of a result because no reward was offered. So they didn't reward anybody with information, so they didn't actually find more information when they needed it. So that's again a police mistake. So now that you've got the information from the cards that we've gone through, it's been quite a long PowerPoint, so I hope you've been stopping it and finishing tasks as you've been going. So now stop it at 1 hour and 2 minutes and make sure that you fill in your cards if you haven't already. Make it look nice, so use different colours for the different headings, do some doodles and some diagrams, maybe shade the table in a little bit, make it stand out in your notes so that you can have each of these bits of information. And then come back at 1 hour and 2 minutes and we will move on to the next task. Okay, so hopefully you finished the task that was looking at the different kind of mistakes and things that were made. I've just got another wee table here about whether or not we can decide if the police were actually to blame for not catching Jack the Ripper or why he wasn't ultimately caught. Now this is a witness table and we're looking for 2 questions for you to answer just in your jotter or your notes using this table to help you on this slide. So we've got some witnesses. We've got Emily Walter, Elizabeth Long, John Best and John Gardner, William Marshall, Matthew Packer, PC William Smith, James Brown, Israel Schwartz, some unknown witness, Joseph Lundy, James Blenkinsop, Mary Ann Cox and George Hutchison. And it tells you which scene or which crime they were actually witnessing, what time they saw whatever it was that was happening, and what they think they saw, so what the appearance actually looked like. So for example, Emily Walter, who saw the death of Annie Chapman, or so she says that she saw at 2 o'clock in the morning a foreigner aged about 37 with a dark beard and a moustache, wearing a short dark jacket, a dark vest and trousers, a black scarf and a black felt hat. Whereas, say for example, our John Gardner, who witnessed Elizabeth Stride, said he saw someone that was 5'5", tall, English, with a black moustache, sandy eyelashes, he looked quite weak and he was wearing a morning suit and a hat. So we're thinking about, if you read each of these different witness testimonies, you could do it as a mind map or a table, or you could just write it out as a couple of sentences. What do most of the witnesses seem to agree on? So it could just be some bullet points. They agree on these things, and what do they disagree on? And see if you can come up with an idea of what things they think Jack the Ripper definitely looked like. So pause it at roughly about 1 hour and 4 minutes, complete this task, and then come back to the next one. So hopefully now you've finished all of the tasks if we've been going. The big question is, would this evidence from this table that we've been looking at actually have been helpful for solving who the Jack the Ripper actually was. Now, there's a couple of reasons why it would, because it gives them an idea of who they're maybe looking for, but also there's a couple of reasons why not. It is very likely that these people were drunk as well at this point in time, out in the streets, so it is likely they've maybe seen some people, but not necessarily all of them would have been the murderer. It also gives them the type of things that they might be looking for in future to try and stop them, but actually the evidence is not overly helpful because all of it is very different and none of them are actually saying exactly the same thing, and different times when they were questioned, even those people would say something different than they had the time before. So it wasn't actually, eyewitness testimony wasn't actually very helpful for trying to solve out who Jack the Ripper actually was out of the suspects, and again in a lot of ways it was another police mistake as to why Jack the Ripper wasn't caught, because the witness testimony was not actually taken seriously at the time or used very effectively. So, conclusions then, and this is the upload task that you are going to do, the first one out of 2. You're going to choose the statement that you agree with the most. So we believe the police are to blame, are not to blame, or are partly to blame for not apprehending Jack the Ripper. So you're going to start that sentence off. So we believe that the police are not, or are partly to blame for not apprehending Jack the Ripper. Evidence to support our argument is, and then you're going to tell me why you think that, and you're going to tell me what you think was the actual reason. So if you think the police are to blame for not apprehending Jack the Ripper, you're going to tell me why you think that. If you think they are not to blame, you're going to tell me why you think that and what you think was to blame. And upload this to your team or email it to your teacher, whatever you have been doing, with your answers. You could do it in a Word document or write it out and take a photo, or you could do it on a PowerPoint slide, absolutely fine, and send it to your teacher. Okay, the last task for this particular case file about Jack the Ripper is a nice way to kind of just finish off, is a documentary for you to watch. It's on BBC iPlayer and you can see the link there, but I will also post the link in the team as well. And you've got 10 questions that you're looking for the answers to in the document. It'll be in the assignment tab. You have to answer the 10 questions while you're watching and then upload your answers to the assignment tab, just like you did for the Victorian slums documentary. And that is your final piece of work to do for this topic so far. Any questions that you maybe have or anything you're not sure about, please let your teacher know, let us know what we can do to help. Make sure you can access everything. If you can't find anything, obviously let us know, but please make sure that you read the instructions in the team really carefully and then let us know if you're having difficulty from there. Thank you for your attention, folks, and good luck with your case study.